let's explore different facets of research design. First, I want to cover experimental versus non-experimental research, one of the major decisions that researchers are facing when designing a study. First of all, what is it? What is the idea behind experimentation and an experimental design? In experimental studies, it's the researcher who takes full control of what happens by systematically varying the independent variables that the researcher is interested in. So the possible causes of effects of phenomena we want to study, the independent variables. So some of these independent variables would be held constant and others would be systematically varied. This variation is done by a so-called treatment or stimulus that creates an experimental condition, as we call it. Then, after applying this treatment and creating the condition, we measure the dependent variable, and the variations in this measurement should then be traceable to the initial treatment. So if we, for example, have two different groups and they receive two different treatments, then we can attribute the differences between the groups to this differential treatment if the groups were similar to begin with. Then we would have expected to measure the same values or the same distributions roughly in the dependent variables. So the most common way to achieve this is to recruit participants for the experimental study. Here it's not fundamentally important that this is a microcosm of the population you want to study. In fact, experiments usually don't define a population of inference, but just take their participants as the starting point, and by sorting them into different conditions on a random basis, we achieve the validity of the experimental logic. So we recruit participants, then we randomly assign them to conditions, which very often is broken down into groups, so experimental groups that get different treatments. But in principle, you can also have groups that get a different combination or series of treatments, so it's not perfectly the same a condition and a group. Not in all designs, at least. But if we have experimental groups to build the conditions, then each group is treated with the experimental stimulus according to the assigned condition. And it's super important that the participants were randomly assigned to the conditions from the entire pool of participants, so we can make sure that they would be the same unless we treated them with the experimental stimulus. Only then, after applying the treatment, the dependent variable is measured. And if that dependent variable systematically varies between the groups, the different experimental treatment of the groups must be responsible for the variation, of course, within the statistical margin of error that we can compute. And this provides a much stronger evidence of causality than if the researcher does not take control and intervene, as in so-called correlational studies, where we use natural variation to explore relationships rather than researcher-induced variation, as in experiments. An example may help to understand the logic. Let's think about a treatment in medicine. So see, we recruit participants who suffer from a certain medical condition, and we have a promising medication for that. And then we randomly assign these patients to two different groups. One of them gets the real treatment, the medicine we think might work, and the other half gets a placebo. And then we measure the progress of the medical condition, and if really the medicated group turns out to have on average systematically lower symptomatology of the condition than the other group that got the placebo, then that's a good indication that the medicine was the cause of this decrease in symptomatology, or this lower value compared to the other group. Good. In the social sciences, there is different types of experimental logic. The basic, the classical experiment is what I just explained, a condition where the researcher has full control over which participants are assigned which conditions, and ideally also full control over the environment and any other changes that might happen to the participants. Two groups of participants randomized into groups receive the same news story as an example. And one of them, the news stories are the same in content except for one thing. One is phrased using sensationalist language, the other using sober language. And then we compare the outcome of interest, say the degree of interest in the news story, or the engagement with the news story, like liking or sharing them. Good. But then we have so-called quasi-experiments, where a similar logic is sought to be applied as in experiments, but we cannot, or for ethical or practical or economical reasons, will not take full control of the variation. The naturally occurring variations need to be used and taken for granted and used to contrast groups. For instance, you recruit participants to ask about their consumption of violent video games. Then you sort the people into two groups, the high exposure and the low exposure group. But that's their naturally occurring video game playing patterns. It's not experimentally induced by the researcher for ethical reasons, so we wouldn't take kids with a very low video game consume and put them in a lab and force them to play video games 24/7 for 2 weeks or something. And then we measure their behavior after being verbally provoked. So we have the high exposure and the low exposure to video games group, and we see how they react to a certain verbal provocation and compare these two groups, and then try to draw a connection between the amount of video game consumption and how aggressively they react to a provocation. The flaw in the logic here is that these kids may have been very different, or these people may have been very different from the outset. There might be something else that's responsible for their high amount of playing violent video games than their and that's what's actually responsible for their aggressive reaction, more aggressive reaction compared to the other group. For instance, they may have suffered many frustrations in their lives and resorted, in a sense, to violent video games as escapism. And so the actual causation is much more contestable than in the classical experiment. But often there's just no other way. Then we have natural experiments where there's just favorable natural variation that sort of replicates an experimental situation. The researcher exploits some real-world variation that is as if somebody had manipulated it from outside. It more or less randomly affects one set of units but not others that are kind of similar, creating an artificial but not researcher-controlled contrast. An example would be a newspaper or printer strike that affects one community and cuts them off from news in their newspapers, assuming that they only read newspapers, which they probably don't, but say there's this community that is then cut off from the news, or there's a longer shutdown of the internet connection in the community. That would be probably a more modern version of that. But the neighboring community isn't, so they stay connected. And then we study changes in perceptions of issue priorities or policy preferences if you're cut off from the news for some period, allowing us to then attribute the changes in the exposed community, the community that still has access to the news. We can then be quite sure that it is the news that stimulate the differences in agenda or opinion formation compared to the other community that's cut off from the news. So again, it is technically possible that these communities systematically differ from the outset in some way that causes the different trajectories, but if the real world event that creates the contrast is obviously unconnected to any such traits of these communities, for example, that's very unlikely. And so natural experiments can be quite strong evidence for causation. A very similar thing is social experiments, where it's not, where it's basically the same thing, but not some external event or happenstance that creates the contrast, but a policy implementation or some other kind of social choice or social process that creates the contrast. This is in a sense a bit weaker because here the variations may are much more likely, the contrasts are much more likely to be tied to some real differences between the groups beforehand. So to take it this way, the researcher exploits that other actors make decisions that create favorable conditions for experimentation. Take as an example that Norwegian health authorities try out a new cancer screening procedure in some communities but not in others. The researcher here has no control over the pick but knows what will happen. Then the researchers can analyze the group differences between the communities with the new versus the old screening procedure. It's also good causal evidence, but also not the same thing as the classical experiment.